Okay, next up we have Kim Harmon.
All right. And now, as they say on Monty Python, now for something completely different. So actually, kudos to the presenters before for all of the excellent risk assessment you have been doing and coming up with really great protocols. It looks like at Northwestern, it's great. It looks like maybe you have access to an industrial hygienist, which is what I am. I work for the Smithsonian Institution. And usually if I'm at a cocktail party, I introduce myself as, hey, yeah, what do you do for a living? I'll hear. And I say, oh, I'm an industrial hygienist. I work for the Smithsonian. They're like, oh, the Smithsonian. That's great. We just skip over the IH part. So what an IH does, we were all sort of born in a factory setting before where we were supposed to assess risk for chemicals that were used in factory settings. And basically what we do is go out and do the sampling piece to find out what the exposures actually are. And I'm usually the one at the Smithsonian that gets the phone calls that say, hey, we've got this object that's got a hazard on it, and we're trying to figure out how to safely handle it. So that usually starts out this risk assessment piece, which is critical for trying to develop some sort of protocols and the labeling and the different methods of control that you're seeing in a lot of these presentations. So to start this out, let's just start with a tale of these 3 books at the Smithsonian that I was introduced to. One of the emails said, hey, we've got these arsenic books. And for each of these books, the question was how do we work safely with these? But each task was just a little bit different. It wasn't just a matter of them checking out the library and looking through them. They were actually different things that they wanted to perform on them. The Aldrovani needed an actual physical sample taken of the cover, which had arsenic in it. The beige album, they wanted to photograph it page by page so that they could use it in a digital archive kind of a thing. And the Emmerling was basically the most general one of it, was that, that is the question everybody has, is it okay, can conservators and researchers basically look through these poisonous books without getting sick or worse? So that's where my journey with poisonous books started. So what I'm going to kind of give you is an overall view of how to do risk assessment, because not everyone has industrial hygienists on their staff or can afford to have those. So, but that doesn't mean you can't do the risk assessment yourself. Usually what I will see most of the time is that everyone finds out that they've got the hazard. So we know what the hazard is. And then we may know how much of the hazard that we have, but that really only paints part of the picture. Not all hazards are the same. Mold is not as toxic as formalin is, or naphthalene, although it smells, it has a tremendous odor, it is not nearly as toxic as arsenic. So the character, whether or not the actual hazard itself is a highly toxic material, something like arsenic, plays into quantifying and assessing how much of a risk is it. And usually if you have a lot of the hazard, then yes, it's going to be a lot more of an issue than if you have only a little bit of it. So the bottom line in a hazard or risk assessment is what you're trying to do is prevent a hazardous exposure. So if I take the book and I put it on the shelf and nobody ever uses it, even though it has arsenic on it, there's not really an exposure hazard there. What I'm more interested in is making sure that those that have to handle it or actually interact with whatever the collection hazard is, that they stay safe. So when you're looking at creating protocols for handling hazardous collections or hazardous books, it's really important to do the first thorough initial assessment and then revisit it. And I'll explain a little bit more why it's really important to come back and do those periodic assessments, even after you think you've got all the protocols in place. Okay. The other 3 things you might want to add to is, yes, I know what it is, and yes, I know how much it has, but condition and activity and exposure are huge pieces of developing that risk assessment. is it whether or not the actual object is deteriorating. If your book is crumbling and falling apart and it's got arsenic on it, that's a way that the arsenic can become airborne. If it's fairly intact, it may not pose as much of a risk. What is the activity you're doing? Are we just going to put it on the shelf, or are we actually going to perform treatments on it or do other types of handling? Or are we just going to display it in a case? So each of those activities may pose different hazard risks. And then exposure. So what kinds are we talking about? Different hazardous materials have different routes of exposure. So some you may be concerned about inhalation hazards, that I'm going to breathe in the dust, but others may actually be absorbed through the skin. So you need to look at what the different exposure possibilities may be. Okay. And the last one of this in particular is where the IH can come in, because we can actually give you data about what type of exposures that there are. You can say, yes, I've got arsenic on this book, or yes, I have lead in this paint, but we can actually test and see what it is you're actually exposed to, which it looks like Northwestern had done some of those tests where they actually were doing some sampling for some of the people that were actually handling the book, which is great. It's helps you determine what you're actually getting exposed to rather than just speculating. So here's just an example. So where, condition and activity exposure are all significant to that risk assessment. So each of these houses has lead-based paint on it, but one is obviously in a much more deteriorated state than the other. So the condition of the deteriorated paint is definitely going to cause more of a risk of inhalation if I say live in this house, or if I'm doing renovation on this house and I'm going to strip the paint off of both of them, it may not matter what the condition is. Both of those activities will create an airborne hazard. Maybe the activity that I'm actually doing in this house, if one of these houses I live in, there's more of an exposure issue. If I want to run a daycare in one of them, there's going to be more of a concern. Or if it's just a house out in the middle of nowhere and we've got a 12-foot fence around it and nobody ever goes there, we're not really going to worry about it, even though the lead hazard still is there. So again, exposure is a big piece of this and should drive, a lot of your policies or your protocols for how you handle these poisonous situations you find yourself in. Okay, so going back to our 3 books, so with the question was whether or not the condition or the activity generate an inhalation or ingestion hazard. So in the case of the Aldrovani, it was in fairly good shape, but there was some crumbling, but we did need to disturb it. They needed to actually take a sample of the paint. The Emmerling, looked pretty good. Pages were intact, but we were going to do the page turning as if, like researchers would do, taking a look at the actual book itself. And then the base, again, they were going to have to turn and set pages each time to actually be able to photograph it for the digital archive they were doing. It was in fairly good condition. There was some loose silhouettes and warping. The base was a little bit different because it didn't actually contain arsenic in the materials itself, but it looked like it had arsenic from some sort of pesticide treatment that it probably received in the past. So as an IH, what we try to do is do some actual exposure monitoring to find out what are the exposures when they're actually handling it. So we usually have the conservator or whoever's handling the book wear a sample pump, and we pull air through sample media and find out basically what they are breathing in while they are working with the books. And then we also did some surface wipe samples of both where the books had sat on the blotter paper or the display holder, and also the gloved hands to see if are we transferring any sort of contaminant to that. In the case of the other two of the books, we actually put them in a lab hood and then shut the lab hood down and just saw if they were off gassing any sort of materials. There was some concern about humidity, maybe creating arsine, that sort of thing. I mean, we were all very new at this, so we were trying to figure out, is there anything actually coming off the book? So we were trying to do some worst case off gassing testing to see if we would actually collect anything on the sample media. Okay. In the Androvani and the Emmerling, all the work and all the sampling, it was all done in a laboratory hood, but the beige one, we weren't able to use a laboratory hood because of the photographing that was going on. And the sample results were very similar to what they found with the Northwestern one that was just presented, that there was contamination basically on the gloved hands and on the blotter surfaces, but we weren't finding anything becoming airborne. We're like, well, maybe that's because we used a laboratory hood, but in the case of the beige, we found no airborne and didn't even find any on the surface of the gloved hands or the holder. So some of the takeaway here was that even though we were very concerned about these arsenic containing books, the amount of exposure that people were receiving wasn't really significant. And the bigger concern was whether or not you're contaminating your hands and then contaminating surfaces and passing that toxin around. So just to kind of finish up or wrap up or give you another tool, is that once you do your risk assessment and you find out, yes, I've got a book, it's got arsenic on it. What are the best ways to control this? This is what NIOSH puts out as the hierarchy of controls of the most effective ways to control exposure and the least effective. Unfortunately, most of us jump to the PPE one first, which is usually the least effective way to control exposures. Basically, human error plays a big part of that. So usually what you want to do is eliminate those hazards. So if you do have hazardous collections that you can, maybe deascension or get rid of, that may be a better way to go. I know the Smithsonian, we have a lot of collections, or we take in a lot of materials sometimes that the curators are trying to find the timeline for them. They may not always have to keep all the collections that they have. So this is a possibility. The other thing to do is to isolate the people from the hazard, which is basically what you're seeing in the libraries where they're taking their green books off the shelf and they're, providing cases for them and separating them from the rest so they're not adding the contamination in there. And sometimes those are the best ways to control it, and then coming up with protocols for the way people would handle these books. Normally I just sit at a desk and look at the book, but now there are protocols in place where now I'm like Northwestern is doing, we put it on a tray, we have a special place where you look at these particular books. So, and I'm just going to leave you with those tools and good luck.
Thank you so much, Kim.